As you have clicked on this video, I'm assuming you have a Native Instruments S-Series Mark III keyboard which is not connecting correctly to your computer. I had exactly the same problem, and I will tell you what I think is the most common issue and obviously try to suggest some solutions. Now, when I had this problem, my first port of call obviously was Google. There are many forums and topics about this problem, and I can't say I have read every one, but I have read a lot, and through reading them and my own experience, I have come to a conclusion which I hope will solve 80 or possibly 90% of the problems, or at least I think I have discovered the issue which is causing the majority of these problems, and hopefully once you understand the issue and the potential problem, you will be able to find a solution. Now, when you first get a MIDI controller, the instinct, of course, is to plug it in and see what happens and see how you can use it. But that does not work with the S3 series. There are 3 things you have to do before you can get it to work with your computer and your software. I suppose I should say at this point that this is mainly PC centric. Now, I don't think Mac users have the same issues. They do have problems according to some of the forums which I've read, because Macs are based around a fairly consistent hardware framework. I think it's easier for software developers to write for them knowing that it's going to work. So I think the issue which I'm going to talk about is less prevalent in Macs. What I'm going to do in this video is start with what I think is the potential problem and offer some solutions. So if you know where you are in the setup process and are stuck, hopefully you will be able to look at these potential solutions and to solve the problem. However, there is a slight danger that you might dash off and try something and find that something is still not working. So I would urge you, if you can, to watch the whole of this video just to make sure that you have dotted all the I's and all the T's and everything is set up and you have gone through all the steps that you need to go through in order to get this to work. So I'm going to start with the solution, I've said that, and then I'll go on to the steps which you need to do before you can get this to work at all. So here is what I think is the main issue, the main problem, and that is an incompatibility between the keyboard and the USB sockets. Now, you may be shaking your head, you may be scratching your head, you may be thinking, what is he on about? But let me, if I may, tell you my story and what happened to me, and hopefully this will shed a little bit of light on the situation. So I was trying to connect my keyboard to a brand new computer. It is 2 months old. It was custom built by a company which custom builds computers specifically for music production. Now, after discussing the specs with the company, we decided on I think it's an Asus motherboard which had 8 USB connections, but only one of them was a USB-C connection. That was a slight aside. I find that a bit strange in this day where USB-C is really becoming the most popular USB connection, that motherboards are still being developed and sold with just one USB-C connection. And I think you can still get motherboards with no USB-C connections at all. But having decided on this motherboard, I said I need more USB-C connections. So the company said, well, we have this backplane USB connector, we can fit that, which gives you another 2 USB-C connections. So when I was setting up the computer, I had an external USB drive, which was classed as a USB A/C drive. And the reason for that was because it had one of these, which is a USB-C to a USB-A connector. And this is not the actual drive, but it's similar to, and the USB-C connector would plug into the adapter like that, and then you could plug that into a USB port. So I used this drive on the previous PC, which did not have any USB-C connectors at all, and it worked perfectly. So when I got the new PC, I removed the adapter and plugged the C plug from the drive directly into one of the C connectors on the backplane slot. And it worked perfectly, as you would hope. So that is where I plugged the keyboard. And it booted up, and the first thing you see when it boots up, it tells you to register the product. Now I'm going to go into this in a bit more detail later on. So I registered the product. There's a piece of software you have to download, so I did that, and it asked me to run the firmware update. So I did that, but it was grayed out. It said it couldn't find a keyboard. So one of the troubleshooting solutions you will see is to try a different port. So I swapped them around. I knew the drive worked on one of the ports. The keyboard did not work on the other port, so I swapped them around. And you can guess what happened. Well, I don't know if you can or not. The drive worked perfectly, but the keyboard still did not work. So it wasn't a problem with the port. Or so I thought. And it was only at this point, after racking my brains and trying several other options, which I shall discuss a little bit later, it was only at this point I remembered that this motherboard had a built-in, if you like, USB-C socket. So I plugged the keyboard into the C socket directly from the motherboard, and here, presto, it worked. Now the built-in sockets are the ones you see on the backplane of the computer. This is a desktop computer, and it has a backplane with the various sockets, USB sockets, the HDMI sockets, the Ethernet sockets. You know what it's like. So I think, what is going on here? And after doing a little bit more digging and a little bit more research, I come to a conclusion which was actually expressed by a few people in some of these forums, that all USB sockets are apparently not made equal. Now there are two aspects to a USB connection. One, obviously it has to transfer data, but two, many of them also supply power, and some of them are dedicated power suppliers, so they will supply power and data, enough power to charge your phone, for example. Now I figured this backplane socket, if it could power an external USB drive, it would certainly have enough power to power the keyboard. Now one of the experiments I tried was in fact to plug the keyboard into this and plug it into one of the USB sockets on top of the computer. And what was quite interesting about that is that the keyboard popped up a message saying there was not enough power to power it. So the USB socket I had plugged it into was obviously not a power carrying USB socket. But as the USB-C socket on the backplane I had plugged it into did not produce this error, I assumed it had enough power to power the keyboard. And why ever would you not? So what the heck is going on here? Well, further digging revealed some interesting comments. And the gist of it was, without delving too deeply into it, not that there's an awful lot to dig into, but the bottom line is that some USB connections, it was suggested, are simply not compatible with some devices. They may work fine with some devices, but not work with others. And that seems to be the case with my system and my keyboard, or at least with these USB-C sockets on this backplane. Now I don't know exactly how USB sockets are configured or how they work, but I know they have to pass data and provide some sort of power. So whether this connection is supplying perhaps not quite enough power, but enough so as not to trigger the error message on the keyboard, or whether there is another problem in regard to the data transfer, I really don't know. But from my own experience, it is obvious that these USB sockets on the backplane are just simply not compatible with the keyboard, although fortunately the one built into the motherboard is. So if that is the issue, if that is the problem, what can you do about it? Now, if my experience is anything to go by, adding a backplane USB socket may not solve the problem. Well, obviously, if your computer has a built-in USB-C socket connected directly to the motherboard, as in a backplane socket on the back of the computer, then plug it into that. Now, if that doesn't work, I have a couple of other suggestions which may or may not work. Now, my backplane socket didn't work. It cost about £6. That's 6 Great British pounds. So you might want to experiment by adding a backplane USB-C socket. Now, I have no idea if this will work or not, and you may just be throwing your money away, particularly if a socket built in to the motherboard does not work. Now, if you do not have a USB-C socket built into your motherboard, well, you're not going to be able to plug the keyboard directly into anything on your computer. So you will need something like this. You will need an adapter. So presumably you have tried this, and if you have, as my experience has shown, not all USB sockets will provide enough power to power the keyboard. So I would certainly suggest try putting it into a different USB socket. The keyboard also has an additional socket for power. So if you have a USB socket that you know is providing power, you could try connecting the keyboard to that socket and see if the increase in power makes any difference. And again, if you don't have a spare USB-C socket, you could use one of these and make sure you plug this into a socket which does have power. Now, I'm saying all this, and I really don't know if the problem is one of sufficient power or something to do with the data transfer. But the Native Instruments instructions, should you choose to read them, do suggest that you use an adapter, something like this, to plug this into a USB-A socket. Now, if you have a USB powered hub, I had one of these on my old machine, then you will know for sure that there is power coming out of the hub. So that, in my opinion, is what seems to be, to me, the most common source of the problem. People have tried to connect their keyboards to their computers and failed. They've sent it back. They've had a replacement and had exactly the same problem. So the problem does seem to lie with the computer and potentially with the sockets rather than with the keyboard. Now, having said that, as I said at the beginning, this may not solve 100% of the problems. But from what I've read online, I think this is going to solve the majority of problems. Obviously, of course, assuming you can find a suitable USB connection. So, having offered what I think is the most likely cause of these problems, I think it's important, well, it is vital that you follow the setup procedures. So let me just quickly go through what you need to go through in order to get your keyboard to work with your computer. So when you first power it on, you will get a message saying you have to register your keyboard within native access. So you may have a card inside your keyboard box with the serial number on. In any event, the serial number will be on the back of your keyboard. So you need to register it within native access. This is native access. Yours will look totally different to mine, depending on what instruments you have installed. The first thing you want to do is to make sure it is up to date and the latest version. And if you look in the top right corner here, if there is an update, a little message will appear telling you to restart. Next, you have to enter your keyboard serial number, which you do by going down to the bottom left and clicking on the Add Serial button. A little window will pop up, enter the serial number here and click on the Add Serial button. I've already entered mine, so I'm not going to do it again, but if you enter the serial number correctly, you will get a little success message. If that does not happen, you need to check the serial number. Sometimes these figures are a little bit difficult to read, so just check that you're not confusing a B with an 8, for example. After you successfully register your keyboard, two things will happen. First, you will get 2 emails from Native Instruments. Well, at least I did. The first one shows you the software which comes with the keyboard. We'll get into this in a moment. This is the second email, which links to a video telling you how to do everything in complete control. Definitely well worth a watch to make sure you know everything your keyboard and software are capable of doing. It also links to an online manual, because we love manuals, especially online manuals, don't we? And you also get a voucher if you want to buy anything from the Native Instruments shop. But most importantly, for getting started, there is a section of the video which shows all the bits and bobs you need to install, how to install them, and so on. So even if everything is working after watching this video, I would absolutely recommend you watch that video just to make sure you have installed everything correctly. Now, when you go back to Native Access, and this may take anything from a few seconds, possibly to a few minutes, and you may have to go up to the top right and click the refresh button. But then if you go to the Available tab, you will see all the new software. And we are interested in one piece of new software in particular. Now, as I have already installed it, it is not in my Available tab. You can see I've still got an awful lot of instruments I have yet to install. So, to show you what you need to install, we have to go to my with the All tab or the Install tab, and if we scroll down, let me see if I can find it, we get to the Hardware Connection Service. This is what you want. This is what you need to install next. With that installed, it's a good idea to check for updates. Go to the Updates tab, and in particular, you should update Complete Control and Contact, as they are the 2 main instruments you will be using with your keyboard. I try to keep mine fairly well up to date, so I have nothing to update here. So yes, the important thing here is to install the Hardware Connection Service. Without that, the keyboard will not be able to talk to the computer. Now, you may want to restart your computer and switch off the keyboard and switch it on again. I'm not sure this is absolutely necessary, but after installing drivers and things like that, it's something which I often tend to do just to make sure that the computer is refreshed and it is getting a good reading of the new drivers and so on. Now, after registering your keyboard with Native Access, if the connection is working, you should then get a message telling you to update the firmware. Now, you can't just use the existing firmware in the keyboard, or at least I certainly couldn't. It didn't work. My theory is that it doesn't contain a working copy of the firmware. Now, I'm making this video in February 2024. The keyboard has been around for a few months, but I know they are working and developing and enhancing and improving the software and the firmware. So my guess is that the company wants you to get the very latest version of the firmware, which is why they don't give you a pre-installed version of the firmware, as I think just about every other keyboard would do. So you really need to update the firmware. Now, you might think that after registering the serial number, after installing the Hardware Connection Service, and after the keyboard then tells you to update the firmware, all would be well with the world. And I reckon it probably will be and should be. But at that point, when I ran the firmware updater, I was getting a grayed out screen saying that it didn't recognize a keyboard. Now, Native Instruments has a page on troubleshooting the firmware installation process, so there's no point in me at all going through this here. I will leave a link to that in the comments, so if you are having trouble installing the firmware, check out that link. Now, I had at this point moved the USB plug to the USB socket on the motherboard, but still the firmware updater was grayed out. However, I clicked on the rescan button and lo and behold, it started to do something. Now, I'd spent hours trying to solve this problem, and I thought, oh, it's going to crash, it's just twiddling its thumbs, it's not going to actually do anything. So I just left it. I went away to do something else, and I don't know how long it took, but maybe about 10 minutes later I came back and I had a success message on screen. Now, I have read posts where people have said it is taking hours to update the firmware, and if that's what they say, well, I've no reason to doubt them, but that just seems to be a really long time to do the firmware update. I don't think I would have had the patience, but certainly you need to give it a lot of time, many minutes, 30 minutes, an hour or whatever. And hopefully if the updater is doing the little spinny thing and it seems to be doing something, then just leave it for hours if need be, and just wait until it does its thing or until it finishes, and hopefully all will be well. So this is probably a bit of a long video, but hopefully if you're having a problem, if you can work around these suggestions, hopefully this will solve it for you. But again, I have to say this is probably not going to solve 100% of problems. So one other thing about firmware updates I'm going to mention is that some people reported problems updating their firmware on a Windows 11 machine. At least this was specifically mentioned in a few cases. Some said they then tried updating on the Windows 10 machine and that worked, and others said they tried updating it on an Apple Mac and that worked. So the takeaway seems to be that there could be, in some cases, an issue between the keyboard, Windows 11 and the updater software. Now, I am running Windows 11 and it worked. So not in every case, but you know, given the hundreds and indeed thousands of potential hardware configurations, I think it's a bit of a miracle that Windows runs at all. So in a sense, it's not surprising that there are sometimes issues between Windows and occasional bits of hardware. But if you're really struggling with the firmware and have another machine to hand, that is something you might want to try. So I can only hope that if you are having a problem, that something in this video has helped you solve it. If not, then I'm sorry, but I'm out of ideas. I have spent hours trawling the web looking for potential solutions, and I think this is the closest universal and probably the most common problem and solution that I have come across. So good luck with getting your keyboard connected. If you are still having problems, I could only suggest you get in touch with Native Instruments tech support and see what they have to say. So please do let me know if this has helped solve your problem, or if you have had a problem and found another solution, then please put it in the description, because I think this could help a lot of other users. So thank you for watching. Good luck with your keyboard, and I will see you again in the next video.